C.S. Lewis before he was C.S. Lewis? Let's talk about it with Professor, historian, and author Mark Noll on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And we are so glad you're here, and you're going to be so glad you're here too, because we got a great hour set up for you. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here. You wouldn't guess it, but Matthew relies on an emotional support animal, specifically a roasted Thanksgiving turkey.
It's gotten me through some hard times.
And our producer, Jinx, is in his little glass booth. He just got back from a business trip to Las Vegas.
Among others.
Jinx, did you do any gambling?
Well, not in Vegas, but at one of my other stops, I got some sushi from a 7-Eleven.
That's a gamble.
That's what happens when you do 5 states in 6 weeks.
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John is thankful nothing broke here at Key Life during the Thanksgiving holiday. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George would be thankful if you included Key Life in your Giving Tuesday plans next week. What was that?
I was going to consider them an emotional support animal.
That's keylife.org/Giving Tuesday. And then, of course, Catherine Wyatt is the soft, feminine side of the program. In honor, I don't believe I'm going to read this. In honor of C.S. Lewis and Thanksgiving, Kathy has combined 2 classic books, The Problem of Pain and The Weight of Glory, into The Problem of Weight.
God bless you, Steve Brown, for doing that.
Matthew, that was pretty okay.
All right, I'll take that.
Hey, guys, we have a great guest. He's one of my heroes, but he doesn't know that. He's emeritus professor of history at Wheaton College and the University of Notre Dame. He was a Protestant missionary to those Catholics, and we'll talk about that later. And he was named by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. Mark has authored numerous books, and the latest, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is C.S. Lewis in America, Readings and Reception, 1935 to 1947. That sounds dull, but it's not. If you are a C.S. Lewis fan, and I am, you're going to absolutely be blown away with this book. Mark, years ago, I became I started taking the C.S. Lewis, New York C.S. Lewis Bulletin and became a subscribing member. And in those days, they had a questionnaire you filled out, and they asked, among other things, how many books did I have by and about C.S. Lewis? And at that time, I had every book that had ever been published about C.S. Lewis and by C.S. Lewis. Now, that has been 100 years ago, and 10 million books have been written, and I have read a lot of them. When I saw yours, I thought, well, nothing new, but it's always fun to think about C.S. Lewis. And I got into your book, and it's brand new. Listen, you're a miracle worker in a lot of ways, and one is you're able to say and give a perspective on something new about C.S. Lewis. Were you just drinking one night and these ideas came to you?
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be with you on your program. How did the idea arise? Like so many things in academic life, it came as a result of a request. Chris Mitchell was the director of the Wheaton College Center devoted to C.S. Lewis and his friends called the Wade Center. And he wanted to have a colloquium, a conference, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death, which people know was the same day as J.F. Kennedy's assassination. So 2013, would I do a paper on something having to do with Lewis's influence? I was working at the University of Notre Dame at the time, and because of the good offices of Notre Dame, they were employing my wife, who was a librarian, as a part-time research assistant for myself. She said, the job's okay, but the boss is sometimes. She was able to do research on the periodicals, newspapers, and magazines that reviewed the early works of C.S. Lewis. That is, C.S. Lewis before Mere Christianity is published and before the Narnia Tales. And those, Lewis was popular beforehand, but those are the books that made him super popular. I think my intent as someone who was a C.S. Lewis reader, not really a C.S. Lewis scholar, my intent was to push past what could be called C.S. Lewis adoration to C.S. Lewis explanation. Who was reading C.S. Lewis? Why were they reading him? Which works of Lewis appealed to which segments of the American population? And it turned out very soon that there were real surprises, and I'm sure we'll get into those when we talk about the book. But it was an effort to put Lewis back in history, and of course to recognize his really superlative talents, but to try to do something historical with how C.S. Lewis was received in the United States.
You, for those of you, and you got to read this book if you're a C.S. Lewis fan. If you don't know who C.S. Lewis is, oh my!
No, don't even go there.
But this book delves into how Catholics received him, how mainline media, they don't do that anymore, received him, how Protestant mainline folks received him, and how evangelicals kicking and screaming eventually received him. And it's a fun book as you begin to... Let's start with Roman Catholics. Given your teaching all those years at Notre Dame, they were the first to, quote, discover C.S. Lewis and to laud what he was... What started that?
Well, Lewis became well known in America after the Screwtape Letters appeared in the United States. That was 1943. Before then, he had been known in the U.S. through more academic circles. He published a book on Paradise Lost. He published a book on Renaissance romance, particularly the work of Edmund Spenser and the Fairy Queen. And there were academics that included Catholics who were reading him. Once the Screwtape Letters was published, and then Macmillan noticing that many people were buying the Screwtape Letters, said, well, we've got to rush some of his other books into print. They published the first, or maybe even the first two of the Space Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy, and then they began to publish also the broadcasts that were available as booklets, where Lewis, during the Second World War, gave short talks on the Christian faith. The Catholic authors were the ones who stood with almost everybody else in celebrating the Screwtape Letters and then the imaginative works. They were unusual, however, in that some of them saw connections between Lewis's academic work on Paradise Lost, his scholarship on the Renaissance literature, and these popular Christian works directly addressing the 20th century. In fact, certainly the most illuminating essays published on C.S. Lewis in America until we get maybe 1950 and following, came from a Catholic English professor at Canisius College in Buffalo and a Catholic literature professor from Marquette University in Wisconsin, putting together what they knew about Lewis as an academic, studying Paradise Lost, studying Renaissance literature, and Lewis is a popular apologist for Christianity in the present day. And no one really else did that. Other academics were a few academics were paying attention to Lewis. A lot of the public at large began to pay attention to Lewis with the Screwtape Letters. The Catholics were the only ones in this period who brought together the popular and the academic.
And those were the days when Roman Catholics and Protestants didn't get along very much, were very critical of each other's heritage. And C.S. Lewis, in those talks you mentioned that became the book Mere Christianity, really rose above all of that. He said, I'm going to talk about things about which old Christians agree and their importance and how they relate to real life. And I suspect that a lot of the Roman Catholics were pleased that a Protestant would say something like that. Of course, Tolkien tried to convert him throughout their friendship. Never quite got there, but he was close. Hey guys, the name of the book is C.S. Lewis in America, Readings and Reception, 1935 to 1947. And if you like C.S. Lewis, you're going to like this book. And if you don't know Mark Noll, you're going to like him too. Hey, this is really hard work, so we're going to have some milk and cookies. Rest up, then we're coming back. So glad you're here with us, as I say and mean, say often and mean always. You always have a place at our table. We're talking to Professor, historian, author Mark Noll, and his latest book is called C.S. Lewis in America, Readings and Reception, 1935 to 1947.
Mark, as we think of C.S. Lewis, you kind of just take it as a given that everybody knows him and his body of work. But like when you take a step back, I never actually thought about it until your book. It's like he straddles some very disparate sections of writing. You know, over here is academic and apologetics, very intellectual, very scholarly. Over here, just broadly accessible fantasy and science fiction even. And similarly, as you've said, different groups, different camps, you know, Catholics, non-Catholics embrace him for different reasons. But off air, you were mentioning that there were corners of evangelicals, Presbyterians, that were like a little bit arm's length at first. I wonder if you could dive into that. What was their nervousness about Lewis?
Sure. It's really interesting to see the reaction to Lewis focused on the same thing amongst Catholic readers, and then amongst the only evangelicals really who paid attention to Lewis were conservative Presbyterians, usually associated with Westminster Theological Seminary. In their journal, there are several articles that express a great deal of appreciation for Lewis. It's people who obviously love his learning, love his wit, love the clarity of his prose, but they're nervous because their understanding of the Christian faith is and was that believers need to trust in God first before they understand how the world works and how salvation is brought. Catholics had a different view. They thought that all humans had a kind of natural understanding at some level of good and evil in the world. And that's actually where C.S. Lewis begins some of his academic work, but also some of his work for more popular. What becomes the booklet that leads to Mere Christianity begins by asking people, do you believe that some things are right and some things are wrong? Lewis goes on to say, almost everybody in the world believes that some things are right and some things are wrong. This natural understanding of right and wrong, he showed, could lead to Christian faith. That's very much similar to what Catholics from the time of Thomas Aquinas had taught about nature being corrupt and needing salvation, but nature nonetheless giving a platform for people to approach God. That, as Lewis explained it, made the conservative Presbyterians nervous. So you have these two groups. They both like C.S. Lewis. They both hope that his basic Christian message can be expanded and explored. But one of them says, we really like the place where Lewis begins. The other says, we're nervous about the place where Lewis begins. The ones who said we like the place where Lewis begins were Catholic reviewers who provided the most extensive and deepest understanding of Lewis in these early years of his exposure to American audiences.
That is so insightful. For those of you who are interested, and most of you are not, that is a classical argument between Reformed Calvinists and those who aren't, and it's called presuppositional apologetics and classical apologetics. And if you're ever asked that on a quiz show and you win any money, just remember 10% goes to Key Life.
Oh, I'm sorry. I fell asleep while you were explaining. Mark, one of the things that I really appreciated, and I think you reference it with C.S. Lewis, was his importance, the importance he placed on understanding the historical setting of writings that he was analyzing. And there's a pretty big difference between the time when America was first discovering Lewis and now, in terms of, I think you put it that, Christian writers were not only expected to, inform the Christian community, but even the general society at large. And we've come way away from that. You point out that now Christian writing is almost suspect, not just ignored, but actually more of a almost hostile reaction. Can you kind of expand on that and the importance of the historical setting?
Yes, I mean, we do live in quite a different era than the 1930s and 40s when Lewis's work was becoming popular in America. One of the things that other historians have pointed out, George Marsden, retired from Notre Dame also, Alan Jacobs, literary scholar from Baylor, is that during the World War II era, general society was looking for a basis undergirding the Allied sense that the Nazis, the fascists, were actually just pointing civilization in the wrong direction. Why was that? Well, there were practical economic military matters, but there were many people who said, what's the foundation? So we had in this era T.S. Eliot, A.H. Auden, several Catholic authors, Jewish authors even, who were saying, we need a basis for our Western civilization. And Lewis's voice was one of the most prominent ones, saying it's the Christian tradition that can provide a secure basis. Remember, in the United States, the ideas of Dewey were becoming kind of the relative approach to pragmatic philosophy. Freudianism was a kind of vogue. And these were intellectual ideas that were challenging the notion that there's a basis in Christianity and Western civilization, and they were challenging the idea that you needed that basis. Lewis was able to articulate very powerfully that basis still was good. And the fact that he could appeal to the general public, Time magazine, the New York Times, widely circulating newspapers, as well as the Christian public, meant that it was unusual. I do think that today that can still be done, but it requires a great deal of skill, and there just is not the receptivity looking for that kind of basis as there was in the 1930s and particularly the 1940s during World War II.
But we may get there, right? The way the news is going.
Well, yes. You just don't know. I think that's one of the things that Lewis and other Christians pointed out. Believers are supposed to do the work they're called to do, and in some sense, you leave to the Lord the effect that it will have. And because of the receptivity of the times, Lewis was really effective when he was, and he continues to be. I think that's actually one of the remarkable things about Lewis's books. Mere Christianity is still read very widely. Narnia Tales are still read. The Problem of Pain is still read. And others on different tracks are still read who proclaim the straightforward Christian message.
And as our culture sinks deeper and deeper into meaninglessness, darkness, annihilationism, it's a scary time. And in scary times, scary people ask questions. And if they're asking questions, and they are, give them Martin Noll's book and one by C.S. Lewis, and they will rise up and call you blessed. And don't go anywhere. We're hanging out with professor, historian, and author Mark Noll. Hey, Mark, if people want to find you online, is there a place they could go?
Well, I'm old enough that I really have never gotten into social media. I think they could certainly send a note to InterVarsity Press, and they would, the publisher of the book, who's done a great job with the book, and they could communicate that way.
So, forget it.
I'm kind of old and enjoy being left alone.
Right. I get that. Listen, you don't have to explain, but you and I have to explain to everybody else.
Write a letter. This is a pen.
Send it by the postmaster.
Mark, when I was reading in chapter 2, the Like a Fresh Wind chapter, this is just a comment on kind of following up on a couple of things that you said. I was just so struck, number one, by the number of, major newspapers and periodicals who commented about Lewis and about what he was writing, and in very positive, with very positive words, and struck, as we said earlier, struck by the fact that how on earth would we ever hope to see that same kind of thing happening nowadays? Because the media just does not seem to be remotely open-minded at all. But I was really struck by that. And the other thing that I was struck by in that chapter was you were quoting a number of different individuals who at one point would say very positive things about him. And I think you've already touched on this as well, very positive things. And then almost like the next sentence, they were saying something that was negative. And I thought, that's odd, because usually, I felt like it was, because usually, you read something, you think, wow, I really like this person, I want to continue to read, or you think, no, not going to do this, and they're done. But there seemed to be this dichotomy or whatever of what was going on in the minds of people at that particular time. Was that? I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just thinking one of the most interesting reviews was by the very celebrated poet and essayist W.H. Auden, that appeared in a literary journal, the Saturday Review. It was a review of Lewis's The Great Divorce. It's overwhelmingly positive, but he does pause for 2 or 3 paragraphs of critique. Mm-hmm. He, for example, he does not like the idea that Lewis introduced the figure of Napoleon into this book, an excellent historical figure. He did not like the fact that Lewis used a lizard to stand for one of the evils that humans perpetuate, because it demeaned the lizard. So he had a critique, but he was overwhelmingly positive. It led on actually to Auden's Episcopal minister went to interview C.S. Lewis and wrote an article, one of the few articles that was not really enthusiastic about Lewis. He said, well, Lewis doesn't know about existentialism. Lewis doesn't seem to care about modern authors. I don't know why people like him, even though my parishioner, W.H. Auden, who's greatly celebrated, likes him. And Lewis, when the minister came to talk to him, was more interested in what Auden was doing and thinking than what the minister was doing. So yes, a real broad appeal. The book ends with Lewis appearing on the cover of Time magazine,
Right. Yeah.
with a very favorable account. Henry Luce, the editor of Time, liked Lewis, and then really interesting, his wife, Claire Booth Luce, who had recently had a celebrated conversion herself to Roman Catholicism, for a while thought that she could bring the screw tape letters to the screen and actually purchased movie rights. It didn't work out, but it was the kind of access that it's hard to imagine today. Time magazine, the leading general periodical, focused its attention on Lewis and a favorable attention. He was learned. He was a great writer. He could communicate, and the rest he left up to the Lord. And that combination of traits maybe is what people should be pursuing today.
You know, I've often said when I was teaching or preaching or speaking that C.S. Lewis was my hero, and if you knew any dirt on Lewis, please keep it to yourself, because you need one hero. And that always solicits a little bit of laughter. Do you think sometimes that those of us who really are fans of Lewis go too far and put him on an altar where he should not be?
Yes, I do actually, and I think it works against what Lewis was trying to do, which was to use the abilities God had given him to communicate as he thought best. And certainly the example of Lewis should be that those of us who come later think about what we can offer, and we try to offer it on those terms, rather than trying to imitate C.S. Lewis. There's a lot of bad C.S. Lewis imitation around, not as much imitating his style, his approach. Deeply learned, deeply concerned about communication, deeply concerned about fresh, sparkling writing. Those are the kinds of things that would be good for believers today to be imitating.
And be careful. C.S. Lewis was a human being like everybody else. He had a fallen nature like everybody else. He was and would have been the first to be horrified when you worship at his altar. So try to keep that in mind. I'm preaching to myself. The book, by the way, by Mark Noll is C.S. Lewis in America. Readings and Reception, 1935 to 1947. If you like C.S. Lewis, you're going to love this book. Hey, we're so glad you're with us. We're talking about C.S. Lewis, who once wrote, "To love at all is to be vulnerable," which, of course, was Lewis' way of saying, don't forget to subscribe to the weekly Key Life email. So do it for yourself. Do it
that
for
was
C.S.
bad.
Lewis. Now wait, and visit keylife.org/subscribe.
That is so bad.
Listen, I didn't write that. I just read it.
Hey, listen, shameless.
Mark, I'm going to say something that's probably not even true, but as I read through this and I'm becoming more familiar a little bit with the timeline of Lewis's earlier works and then later on, it seems like the original or the earlier stuff was designed for the smarter people, the academics and, that kind of thing. So later on down the road, it was like just the average, John Q. Public or whatever kind of thing when you get into Mere Christianity and of course the Chronicles and that kind of thing. Was it that stuff, those books that really propelled him across the across lines to the greatest amount of his popularity? And also, on that note, was that when his popularity in the U.S. got bigger?
Right, exactly. I mean, he is known to a small set of academics who appreciate his work in the 1930s. It's with the publication of the Screwtape Letters, which came out a year later in America than in England, that made him really popular. And then it was even later that the booklets were pulled together to form Mere Christianity. And then beginning in 1950 or 51, when the Narnia Tales were published, it became really popular. You do mention his ability to talk to ordinary people. I think there's a good story there, and one that shows that Lewis could learn and be critical of himself. He was asked right at the start of the Second World War to bring addresses to training centers for troops. And he reports that he did this kind of work, and the first few times just bombed disastrously, because he was talking to the recruits as if they were a common room at Oxford University, one of the colleges. And he was successful in changing how he spoke without changing the basis from which he spoke. In other words, he kept a very clear sense of, as Steve said earlier, the Christian basics. He wasn't trying to make anyone an Anglican, a Presbyterian, a Catholic, or Pentecostal, but he was presenting the Christian bases, but he was doing it in a way that could communicate to people who did not have an education. He later wrote an essay in which he said he thought it would be a great final exam for a seminarian to write about a complicated Christian doctrine in words of 1 and 2 syllables that everyone could understand. So he had to learn how to keep the foundation of real deep learning, and yet to be able to communicate in ways that could address a population at large. And obviously he learned his lesson. Although it's worth noting, he kept writing some academic. His major academic work was a history of English literature in the 16th century without drama. And it's only published, I think, in 1954 or 1955. So he kept that going even while he was addressing the public at large.
He, by the way, paid a price for his popularity among some of his colleagues. I would file it under jealousy, but they filed it under something else. And that affected Lewis. I mean, he winced at that. And I find that kind of winsome, kind of attractive that he did. I understand that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're popular. Everybody resents it. I mean,
yeah,
you can identify with Lewis. So,
no, I know.
No, I got it.
I'm not saying that.
No, I think we all heard that.
I heard it.
I get no respect around here.
It was just there. Mark, obviously with 35 to 47, those are the years that the book is concerned with, and the Narnia books came post that. But just curious how those landed in the States. Obviously, they're very popular now, but social mores are different. For Christians in general, was fantasy something that was like, oh, this is kind of dangerous, or at that time was it like, yeah, baptized imagination, this is all allegorical, we welcome this? Is there any kind of consensus around that kind of reception?
Yes, I think there is. I do think that the imaginative works that were shown first, actually, for the first book that Lewis published was in 1934-35 in the U.S. The Pilgrim's Regress was a kind of allegory of how he had actually become a Christian. Did not receive a whole lot of attention, in part because it was actually very learned, but also because of the medium. And when he did publish the Screwtape Letters and then the Space Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy, there was nervousness. But I think because of the success of Narnia, and then, of course, even the greater success of the Tolkien's work, then the Christian world thinks of fantasy as a good vehicle for expressing some basic Christian truth. And again, as I mentioned before, I think some of those who have written Christian fantasy have done well, and some who have done that have not done well.
So true.
The genre, the method was accepted, but sometimes with good results and sometimes with bad results.
Mark, we've referenced Tolkien a couple of times, and also Lewis's effort to be, as you summarize it, deeply learned, theologically focused, and unusually creative. But he attempted those things, but had a group of people that he bounced his writings off of. Talk some about the helpfulness of that group.
Right.
The
Steve has
Inklings.
mentioned that he did receive quite a bit of critique and envy and just lack of understanding from academic colleagues. But he did have a smaller group, maybe 10 to 15 people that met regularly, that he heard from, and who would tell him that what he'd written was crap if they thought what he'd written was crap. They met over drinks once a week or a couple of times a week, and that might have loosened a few tongues. But yes, Lewis was keenly aware that if you thought of yourself as somehow godlike in what you wrote, you were in real trouble. And I actually closed the book with a poem that Lewis wrote about the dangers of someone who seems to succeed as an apologist. And it's a very humble poem about that's the most dangerous point for a person speaking for Christianity. You think you've been a success, and what you should realize is any success you've had is due to the grace of God working through the instrument that you have become.
Mark,
Wow.
we're out of time. I don't know what happened to this hour. It just flew by. We appreciate very much you writing this book, but also taking an hour out of a very busy schedule and spending it with us. Hope we can do this again. The book, C.S. Lewis in America, Readings and Reception, 1935 to 1947. They're better titles. That sounds boring, and it is anything but. Get this book and read it. Great things about doing a program like this is that I get a chance to spend some time that I ordinarily wouldn't be able to spend with some of the people that I have admired from the distance. And Mark Noll is certainly one of those. I'd met him before, but never been able to sit down and talk. And his insights are amazing in a lot of areas, and not just this one. He's been faithful. He's lived on the edge, but he's been faithful to the primary verities of the Christian faith in the midst of his scholarship and the places where he worshiped and the places where he taught. And that was true of C.S. Lewis. One of the things that I love about C.S. Lewis is, of course, what he wrote. And I've read almost everything that he wrote, even some of the academic things, and I'm very appreciative of the gifts that we've been talking about over the past hour. But there are things about C.S. Lewis that are different than that. For instance, he made a whole lot of money, and he gave away a whole lot of money, and nobody ever knew it. People were in need, and they would get a check from him or money from him, and it was never reported, it was never waved, it was never in the press, and people didn't know it. And the way he took time to write to anybody who wrote him, he answered every letter that had ever been sent to him. And there is a book that you might want to read sometimes called Letters to an American Lady. Nobody is a nobody, but if you were going to use a colloquial description, the lady to whom he wrote, and her name is never given, is a nobody. She's not somebody that could do anything for C.S. Lewis or help him or sell books or any of that. And yet over all those years, he kept that correspondence going. And I see that, and there are a pile of other things about Lewis that are like that. But even with all of that being said, I must be careful, and you must be careful too, because we have a tendency as human beings and sinful to create idols and to pray and kneel before those idols. And nobody belongs on that altar except God. And so remember that C.S. Lewis was used, and he would say ditto to what I'm saying. Who's going to be on next week?
Next week, our friend Ray Ortland is going to be with us, who's been with us before, and he's got a great new book out. I'm anxious to look at it, read it. It's titled You're Not Crazy, Gospel Sanity for Weary Churches.
It's going to be great. Hey, you guys, join us same time, same place next week. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't do, and that gives you a wide, wide berth.
Which you'll need after Thanksgiving.
Exactly. And speaking of Thanksgiving,
The glorious day.
yeah, now listen, I need some ideas.